Today, I want to give you guys a comparison between Putin and Julius Caesar. Putin invaded Ukraine as a response to NATO advancement, expansion, encroachment around Russia's sphere, around Russia's borders. We saw this in 2008 when the United States was talking about including Georgia into NATO, and Putin invaded Georgia. I am kind of perplexed at the fact that people will say things like, I can't believe Putin has invaded Ukraine, a sovereign country. How could he have done something like this? And they act as if Putin just woke up one morning and said, yeah, I just really want to invade Ukraine. I hate Ukrainians. And I just really want to invade a sovereign nation. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 as a response to NATO doing the same damn thing that it was doing with Ukraine. NATO was doing military training exercises. For Pete's sake, naval training exercises in Ukraine. And the Russians were warning the Americans, warning NATO, stop doing this, don't do this, we're warning you, we're very serious. And Russia, in February of 2022, invaded Ukraine. And the Americans were acting so shocked, when the reality is that the Americans knew that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. The Americans knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that NATO's actions would provoke the Russians to invade Ukraine. NATO knew that by talking about including Ukraine into NATO, the Russians would respond with war. Why? The Americans knew that the Russians were concerned that including Ukraine or putting Ukraine through the process of entering NATO would split Ukraine up, would divide the population between those who are anti-Russia and those who are pro-Russia, and would thus spark a civil war. And that's pretty much what happened. Because NATO was working to include Ukraine into the Western military bloc, into the economic bloc of the West. And that's what the EU trying to do a free trade deal with Ukraine was about. And the Ukrainians who were pro-NATO did a revolution that overthrew Yanukovych. And there was a new government that was ushered in. Those who were pro-Russia were very scared of the fact that they were seeing Nazis on the streets. They were very scared of the fact that when pro-Russian activists went to do a counter Maidan assembly, that they were physically attacked. People were killed. Police officers were killed. You had the rise of a neo-Nazi paramilitary organization, and that organization was embedded into the Ukrainian military. All of these things indicated to those who were pro-Russia that Ukraine was becoming a state heavily influenced by Nazis, heavily influenced by those who are very antagonistic towards Russians. And when they saw crowds of Ukrainian nationalists jumping up and down, screaming, "Those who do not jump are Russian," put the Russians to the rope, meaning hang the Russians, put them on nooses. When they saw these things, when they saw the video of the Azov battalion crucifying a man, I understand that happened during the war, but still, it further indicated that their fears were warranted. And after the Euromaidan, it didn't take very long for those who were pro-Russia in eastern Ukraine to take over government buildings and to form their own self-proclaimed republics. And they began to demand autonomy. They did not want to be under the Kiev regime. They did not want to be under the new government that was the result of the Euromaidan revolution. They were counter-revolutionaries. So there was indeed a civil war that took place as a result of NATO trying to integrate Ukraine into the Western sphere. The Americans knew exactly what they were doing. NATO knew exactly what they were doing. And this is how I know that NATO knew this. In 2008, there was a statement written by William Burns, who at that time was the ambassador to Russia. Now, William Burns is the head of the CIA, but he was once the ambassador to Russia. And this is what he wrote in 2008. And this was, he wrote this as an embassy cable. And he said, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. So Russia did not want to invade Ukraine. Putin did not wake up one morning and say, oh, I just want to invade Ukraine because I hate Ukrainians. And this really flies into the face of this very common way of talking that to me is actually quite obnoxious. And it goes something like this. Putler, and this has been a kind of a buzzword that's being used all over Twitter, and Twitter is one of the most Twitter is probably the most toxic, most cancerous place on the internet, if not one of the most. Because you see all of this type of jargon and yammer on Twitter. You know, Putin, Putler, they're doing a play on words, basically, equating Putin to Hitler, so they call him Putler. Oh, Putler is a maniac lunatic who just invaded a sovereign nation. And it's like, no, Putin had to make a decision that he really didn't want to have to make. They were doing military exercises in a country that's right on Russia's border. I don't have to be some professor to tell you that that would piss off any country. If Russia went into Mexico and started doing naval exercises with the Mexican Navy and started doing military exercises and battle simulations in Mexico, do you think America would be sitting there saying, Mexico's a sovereign country. We should just let them do what they want to do? If Mexico wanted to join Russia's alliance, the alliance that Russia has with Armenia and Belarus, do you think America would be sitting there saying, Mexico's it's a sovereign country. It's a sovereign nation? No, they wouldn't. America would not like that at all. And at the very least, they would be warning Russia to back off. And for one thing, Mexico would not want to be involved in military training exercises with the Russians. During World War I, Germany asked Mexico to attack the United States. And America went to war. America joined the First World War and fought the Germans and defeated the Germans. So it's ridiculous to sit there and say, oh, well, yeah, it's just Putin just decided to invade a country for no reason. And NATO was provoking Russia. For example, on February 19th, 2022, just days before Russia would invade Ukraine, the leader of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said, and he threatened Russia. He said, if Kremlin's aim is to have less NATO on Russia's borders, it will only get more NATO. So in other words, Russia doesn't matter if you don't like it. You're going to get more NATO. Basically telling Russia you're powerless. We're not afraid of you. So Russia had to show its muscle. It had to show that it has teeth. It has teeth. It's amazing that you have conservatives here in America who will sit there and say, we need a country that has balls. We want a country that has masculinity and strength, and we don't want the world to be laughing at us. We want a country that's strong. And they'll sit there and they'll watch Jocko Willink. Because Jocko Willink is teaching our youth about masculinity. Well, Jocko Willink says that at times, you have to show people that you have teeth. And if the world is making a mockery out of Russia and just doing what it wants around its borders and doing military exercises and naval training exercises and putting billions of dollars worth of weapons in Ukraine, you don't think the Russian people are sitting there thinking, we need a country that has balls? They're saying just that. Just like if Russia was doing the same thing to America, going to Mexico, going to Canada, doing military training exercises, you don't think Americans would be sitting there saying, look, Russia's making a mockery out of us. You don't think some Republican politician would be sitting there saying, our government is so weak, it doesn't have any balls, there's no testosterone, there's no masculinity, there's no backbone, guys. It's all just a bunch of cowards. And a bunch of the American masses would be sitting there saying, yeah, we need a leader like that. We need a leader who's got balls. You people sit there and accuse Russia. But if the same thing was happening to America, you would be complaining about that. You would want some politician to say, look, we can't allow America to be mocked. We can't allow America to be the laughingstock of the world, to be just constantly bullied by other countries. So it makes no sense to sit there and act surprised about the fact that that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, here's another thing. One of the masterminds of the Cold War, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the masterminds of the Cold War, a very sinister, serpentine character. He was one of the guys who pushed for the policy of arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the United States armed the Mujahideen, and Russia invaded Afghanistan. And then America said, oh, look, poor Afghanistan, the poor Afghans, they're victims of the evil Kremlin. The Soviet Union, right? It was Russia, right? But technically it was the Soviet Union, but it's Russia. Because America hates Russia no matter what. If it's the Soviet Union, if it's under Tsardom, America's going to hate Russia. Because Russia is the only country in the world that can really flip the bird to the Americans. That and China also. So, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan as a response to the Mujahideen being armed. Zbigniew Brzezinski, years later, divulged that the reason why the United States armed the Mujahideen was to provoke Russia into invading Afghanistan. And he said very specifically that the plan worked. And once the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, The Americans armed and trained the Mujahideen and used them as a proxy to defeat the Soviets and to drive them out of Afghanistan. And Zbigniew Brzezinski makes it very clear that the purpose of this was to cripple the Soviet Union, was to demoralize, wound, cripple, and really devastate the Soviet Union. So the United States armed the Mujahideen to provoke the Soviets into invading Afghanistan and to then have the Mujahideen defeat the Soviets for the purpose of wounding, crippling the Soviet Union. The United States has done the same damn thing with the Russians in Ukraine. The Americans knew that the Russians would eventually be faced with the decision to invade Ukraine if the United States started working to bring Ukraine into NATO, into the Western sphere. They were giving the Ukrainians weapons. They were giving the Ukrainians military training. The Americans knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly that they were pissing the Russians off and provoking them. And let me tell you, all these American journalists and bloggers and commentators are like, sovereign nation. But I can guarantee you, the people who are behind the curtains, the guys with the black suits, it's business as usual for them. They knew exactly what was going to happen. Just like before the Syrian revolution took place, the Americans knew that you would eventually have instability in Syria as a result of removing Saddam Hussein. And they knew that Turkey eventually would enter Syria if there is a civil war. They know all this stuff. You see, there's a weird trend that I've noticed in the blogosphere. Oh man, I also want to talk about Julius Caesar in this video, but as I talk, things are coming up in my mind. There's a very weird trend that I find kind of silly and kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of annoying and obnoxious. People will sit there and say, well, the reason why this happens is because the politicians are all idiots and they don't know what they're doing and yada, yada, yada. In some cases, this indeed happens. Okay, fine, I will concede that, but come on. There's certain things that countries do wherein they know exactly what they're doing. They do certain things knowing exactly what the response is going to be. They do certain things knowing exactly what the effect is going to be, cause and effect. They all understand these things. It's like, oh man, it's like Mogadishu. You know, I've heard that when the Americans went into Mogadishu to capture General Adid, they expected that the mission would take 30 to 45 minutes. And they say, and the battle, the mission ended up taking 2 days, right? And it was a disaster. I think 19 Americans died, a bunch of civilians were killed, a couple of helicopters were destroyed. I mean, it was disastrous, right? It did not look good for America. But you hear things like, well, you know, they thought that the mission was going to take 30 to 40 minutes. And I'm thinking, they didn't know that this was... Nothing takes 30 to 40 minutes. I mean, some things do, right? But capturing a warlord does not take 30 to 40 minutes, especially in a neighborhood like Mogadishu. Well, they didn't, and they say, well, they didn't expect that the whole neighborhood was going to fight the Americans. It's the Muslim world. When a Kafir army is going to go into a Muslim country and try to capture one of their guys, it's part of their culture to work collectively as a society to fight against their enemy. This is like the Israelis saying, yeah, you know, we're going to go into Gaza and we're going to capture a terrorist. It's going to take, you know, Yuri, it's only going to take like 30 to 40 minutes. No, the Israelis would know exactly what they would be up against. They would know exactly that they would have to fight against the populace, that they would have to fight against the whole damn society. It would not take 30 to 40 minutes. Maybe it would take 30 to 40 minutes if you had a huge armada with you and a huge military entourage with you. But to send in 100 soldiers into a city with thousands of, maybe, I don't know, 1 million people. I don't know how many people lived in Mogadishu at the time. But to send in 100 soldiers into an entire city to take a warlord, I mean, that wouldn't take 30 to 40 minutes. And maybe I don't know, I find it difficult to believe that the Americans didn't know that. I find that hard to believe. Maybe the Americans really were that unknowledgeable about it. I don't know. But then they'll say things like, Putin believed that invading Ukraine would be a cakewalk. It would only take a couple of weeks or something like that. It's like, what? The Russians, for almost a decade, have been backing a proxy war in Ukraine. They've been backing a proxy war since 2014 against the Ukrainian government. It's quite obvious that the Russians know how the Ukrainians would work. It's quite obvious that the Russians would already know that by invading Ukraine, you would not only be facing the Ukrainian military, but you'd be facing the Ukrainian military with all the damn NATO weapons that NATO would flood into Ukraine, into the country. The Russians had to have known that. I just find that difficult to believe that the Russians didn't think that it was going to be a super difficult mission, and it would take more than weeks, and it would take months and months and months. I mean, it's still going on. This war is probably going to last for years. I find it hard to believe that the Russians wouldn't know that they would have to face not only the Ukrainian military, but Ukrainian militia, Ukrainian paramilitaries, Nazi paramilitaries. I mean, people on the internet knew that. I knew that before the war even happened. I wrote an article about it saying, hey, if Russia goes into Ukraine, they're going to have to face the Ukrainian paramilitaries, the Nazi paramilitaries. It's quite obvious. It's like the Lebanese civil war. I mean, if you have a civil war in Lebanon, it's not going to last a couple of weeks. It's going to last years. Because when you have two sides that historically hate each other, you can't just expect the battle to end in a matter of weeks or even months. So you just see this sort of thing, and you're just like, I don't know. But I want to tell you guys something about Julius Caesar. This is something that I found out today. I started reading this book. It's called, it's called The Conquest of Gaul. And it's basically a compilation of documents that were put together by Julius Caesar when he was fighting the Gauls. And the war lasted for 8 or 9 years or so. And going into this book, I wondered, why did Rome go to war with the Gauls? And why did the Romans take over Gaul? Why? And the generic conventional answer would be something like, well, power, right? It's all about power, and it's all about pride and grandeur. But when you actually read the documents for yourself, what you find is that Julius Caesar heard, he got intelligence that a certain warlike tribe amongst the Gauls called the Helvetii was going to pass through the Roman territory in Gaul. Now, there was a territory in Gaul in the south called the province. You hear about Provençal wine, Provençal cuisine. Oh, it's so delicious and all these things. Well, Provençal was the region of Gaul that the Romans controlled. It was called the province. In the book, it's called, in the English translation, it's called the province. And this warlike tribe, they had this dream of controlling all of Gaul. The thing is that the Helvetii controlled a territory that was about 200 miles wide or so. They wanted to control all of the Gaelic tribes, all of the Gaulish tribes. And they wanted to leave their territory to begin their expansion. Well, the only way to leave their territory was either through two different routes. One was through one route, which was very, very narrow, and the other route was through Roman territory. Well, the most convenient route was through the Roman territory because it was very wide. It was a whole region. And as soon as Julius Caesar heard that this tribe was about to cross that territory, Julius Caesar left Rome and went to Gaul. And Julius Caesar told this tribe that they would not be allowed to go through Roman territory. So the tribe the Helvetii decided to go through the very narrow pathway, and they went through it, and then eventually they were getting close to the province. And Julius Caesar, and I'm going to read to you guys apart from this book, Julius Caesar, seeing that this tribe was going to settle in an area that was very near Roman territory, knew that he had to go to war with this tribe because this tribe was very warlike. And the Roman government had a history with the Helvetii. About 50 years or so before Julius Caesar's war commenced, the Helvetii attacked Roman territory in Gaul and killed a lot of Romans. And there was one particular death of a Roman that really stayed in the mind of Julius Caesar. It was when his wife's grandfather was killed by the Helvetii. So Julius Caesar always remembered that, and by fighting the Helvetii, he saw it as vengeance against them for what they did to his wife's grandfather. So it says here that Caesar was informed that the Helvetii intended to cross the territories of the Sequani. So remember, there was only two routes by which they could exit their territory. One was through a route that was very, very narrow. This was controlled by a nation of Gaul called the Sequani and the Aedui. And it says here that Caesar was informed that the Helvetii intended to cross the territories of the Sequani and the Aedui, or the Aedui, and to enter the country of the Centoni, which is not far from that of the Tolosates, a tribe living in the Roman province. He saw that it would be very dangerous to the province to have a warlike people hostile to Rome established close to its rich cornlands, which were without any natural defenses. Eventually, the Sequani, or eventually the Helvetii would go through the route controlled by the Sequani, and they would begin to pillage the different Gaulish tribes, and they began to pillage the Aedui. And these Gaulish tribes went to Julius Caesar and they said, "Oh, please help us, Julius, please." And he helped them. He didn't want to see those people genocided. He didn't want to see those people massacred. So here we have an interesting comparison. Here we have a warlike people, hostile to Rome, has a history of going to war with the Romans, getting near Roman territory, and Julius Caesar responding by going to Gaul and being prepared to go to war with these people over this, going to war, having the will to go to war with a nation that was going to settle near your territory. And also Julius Caesar defending these tribes who were being massacred by the Helvetii. Nobody can sit there and say, well, Julius Caesar was crazy for wanting to go and fight a nation that's very warlike, that was hostile to Rome, that was going to park themselves near Roman territory. And no one would call Julius Caesar crazy for wanting to go to war to defend these tribes that were being slaughtered, that were being oppressed. With the situation of Russia, you have a situation in which you have NATO, which is hostile to Russia, is in rivalry with Russia, doing military training, doing military exercises in a nation that borders with Russia. And you also have the Ukrainians being trained by NATO. Ukrainian nationalists have a history of conflict with the Russian people, Second World War. The Ukrainian nationalists fought against the Soviets, wanted to kill Russians. And Ukrainian nationalists are very hostile to Russia, and the Ukrainian nationalists were killing Russians. The Ukrainian government was killing Russian civilians in eastern Ukraine. And so the Russians were faced with a decision. The decision to either go to war or just allow NATO to park themselves in Ukraine and do military exercises and arm the Ukrainians and really show hostility to Russia. And Russia made the same exact decision that Julius Caesar made, and that was to go to war. And so this really flies into the face of the whole narrative of oh my God, evil Putler just decided to go to war for no reason. No, it was all based on real geopolitical knowledge, and it was based off of a real situation that was happening around Russia that showed hostility, and it was a response to that. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.